Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. And as Lonnie said, my intention today is to talk about really a kind of overview of an aspect of child development that people are becoming increasingly familiar with, but may not really recognize the sort of practicality of it day to day that fits into the overall picture of what we know helps children thrive, which I think really is our goal for all of us as parents always, is what can we do to most set our children up for success. Although I would also say that my goal in even talking about it, hopefully, is to simplify things for parents, because I think we're always being told we have to be doing one more thing and doing one more thing differently. And really what I feel quite strongly is that if we can understand this one aspect of child development, it often lets us put aside a lot of the stuff that's kind of confusing about the modern world. The other thing I'm interested in showing you today is just how many of the different topics like ADHD and mindfulness and resilience and all these buzzwords we're hearing in life relate, at least in part, to the concept of executive function. But I'm starting with this image from Monty Python for a reason, which is to say that one of the things I think we need to look at for all of our children is we can't predict everything that's going to happen. We can't control everything that's going to happen for them, obviously. And there's an old saying somewhere along the lines of, we can't lay leather down over all of the road ahead for our children, but we can try to make them a really good, solid pair of boots. And from a developmental perspective, what executive function in many ways functions as is that good pair of boots. It's like, how are we going to create the skills that children need in order to thrive for themselves? And what I'm going to do today then is, for the first half of the talk, which is actually the first three parts of the talk comprise almost the first half, is really just lay out what is executive function. Because to me, if you're a parent and you can understand what it means in a real way, instead of sort of an academic kind of humdrum kind of way, it can really affect your decision making day to day. Emphasize for a little bit why it matters so much to understand it. And then really what I think is a new way of thinking about child development and executive function is recognizing what the typical path of development of executive function looks like in children and how that relates to a lot of things that are going on in schools and in our community today. The second half of the talk, though, which is what most parents typically want to hear, is, and then looking at all that, recognizing it, what is it that we can actually do that matters? And that's really what I want to emphasize today. So as we start talking about executive function, it may be one of those words that starts to sound kind of dry and humdrum and sounds like something like this. So this test up here is something called the Stroop, and you're supposed to read it as fast as you can without getting tripped up by the fact that the the colors and letters don't match. And even as I'm saying it, it sort of almost wants to put me to sleep. It turns out that really executive function doesn't have to do with anything as specific as a pen and paper test. It really has to do with stuff like this, more practically speaking. So this slide says, for anyone who can't, you should be able to, in this auditorium set up for everyone to see it, it says, do I know how fast I was going? Isn't that your job? So how is it that moment to moment in life, under stress and when challenged, we manage to modify our behavior and make our behavior situationally appropriate? Executive function also relates to this concept. So the slide, for anyone who can't read it, it says, remember when we used to have to fatten the kids up first? So how is it in a modern world where we're just immersed in we're abundance, really, we manage to modify, keep track of our eating and our health and make good health choices? For parents, for all of you here today, executive function is that really the skill set you use to do all of these different things. How did you get here on time? How will you know when to leave if you need to go somewhere else? How do you handle, start thinking about that difference between knowing what needs to happen to get dinner on the table, literally just a list of ingredients, things that need to happen, and then actually coordinating it in some way. So getting everything on the table by a particular time and getting homework done and juggling everything else that has to happen in the afternoon, what managerial level skill set are you using to make that happen? Or when it comes to frustration in life, what do you do when you're on your way out the door for vacation and your boss says, there's one last thing that needs to happen? So how do you just sort of keep track of that moment in a way that doesn't get you fired and then actually gets the work done? So when you look at executive function and why this skill set is just part of everyday practical life for all of us, what you see is that executive function, the brain had to evolve a set of skills to sort of supervise and coordinate everything. It's kind of like the conductor of the orchestra. You can have all the greatest musicians in the world, and if the conductor isn't doing his job, you're not going to get music. You can pick almost any field. For a school, you need a principal. It's not how good the teachers are, how strong the teachers are, how well trained they are. You need someone to run the school. And executive function is a cognitive skill set that we all require to do all these different things that are on the slide, to sustain our actions towards goals. And you can start thinking a little bit of what it means if you don't have that skill. You can be motivated and struggle still with that skill of sustaining action. How does it mean to know how to moderate our behavior in different ways situationally? I have to behave very differently on stage here and answer questions differently than I would like hanging out with my friends on a Saturday night. How do you keep track of that level of detail? And again, subtly different from social intuition. Like you can understand there's a social aspect to that and there's a managerial level aspect to that. How do you do things culturally appropriately? And then how do you make all these complex decisions we have to make in life all the time in a way that maximizes our long-term welfare and not just what's right in front of us all the time? So on a practical level, when we're talking about working with children, we have to recognize that separate from their motivations, separate from the traditional way we think of intelligence, for lack of a better word, for creativity, from their artistic abilities, from their athletic abilities, separate from the entire package of skills they bring to the table, they require a skill set like this. The brain manager is responsible for coordinating, planning, time management, everything up top that helps make sure you use all the abilities you have to the best of your capacity. And that's really what executive function is. But most interestingly is what we can learn from why executive function matters. So what really got me up here even talking about it is this new body of research, some of which you may have heard about. So how many people here are familiar with the marshmallow test? Most people probably are nowadays. One of the things I would say whenever I give a talk like this is, no one study really proves anything all on its own. So when I'm using studies, I'm using them typically as examples of a larger body of research. But for anyone who isn't aware of the marshmallow test, what the marshmallow test is basically the setup is a preschool-aged child goes into a room with an adult, and then the adult almost immediately pretends that they need to leave. They just say, like, look, just got a call, got to step out for a minute, but I tell you what, there's a marshmallow on the table. If you'd like, you can have that one marshmallow right now, but if you can wait till when I get back, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. And then if you watch the clips of this, it's kind of like candid camera when we were kids. So the kids are like, they lick it and step back, and they sit on their hands, and they sing songs, and they squirm, and they do all these things, whatever they can, to try to wait for the second marshmallow, except that not all of them can. So the researchers in that study are able to separate the fact that there are low delayers who sort of wait a little bit and then just eat the marshmallow. And then there are high delayers who struggle, but they get their 2 marshmallows. And there's 2 caveats before I go into that research, a little more that are important to know. One is all this type of research talks about trends in child development. So if your child really loves marshmallows and couldn't possibly wait, they're not doomed for life. They're probably just fine. That just happens too. And then the other one I think is really interesting, that after all these years of talking about this study, there was a friend of mine who's actually a writer for a living who was the first person to point this out, is like, isn't it possible that there's a subgroup of kids who have such strong self-management skills that they look at one marshmallow and say, yeah, that's enough, and then have 1 marshmallow? And that's possible too. So there's bigger trends we're talking about here. But the interesting thing about this research is that it comes in several steps. The first thing they looked at was behavior. So maybe it's intuitive that if you have stronger self-management skills in that moment, they were able to show that the low delayers are more likely to have behavioral difficulties in preschool. That's kind of common sense. Now, if you can manage your impulses better, you might behave a little better. However, what was amazing about this research, which was done, the person best known for it is Walter Mischel. What was amazing about this is they've been able to follow those same children into adulthood now. And based on this one measure of preschool self-management skills, of preschool executive function, they were able to show that the high delayers tended to do better on standardized tests in high school. And then 10 years later, the high delayers were less likely to be overweight. They didn't look at anything else except this one measure of low delay, high delay in preschool around a marshmallow. Actually, if you look at the actual paper, it could have been one of several treats, but it's become known as the marshmallow study. When you look at other studies of this same skill set, you see that preschool measures of executive function correlate with behavior and social competence as children get older. And again, just based on preschool levels of self-management skills. Strong self-management skills start to correlate with things like reading and math success, academic success as you get older. In one study, they looked only at attention. They didn't look at anything else except attention in preschool and found that there was almost a 50% greater chance of graduating college on time if you had stronger attentional skills in preschool. And in a New Zealand study, they were able to track executive function against all these different, they apparently in New Zealand, you think Facebook is bad. It sounds like they track everything in New Zealand possible because they were able to track early childhood executive function against things like the likelihood you were going to get divorced, the likelihood you were going to have an appropriate salary when you're older, your money you were earning. All these different measures of adult success were predictable based on just these childhood measures of executive function and self-management skills. So these early childhood measures of executive function correlate very strongly with all the things we want for our children growing up, in essence. Another way of looking at executive function is it's a part of the brain that we use to problem solve and persist and manage challenges. And I think it's an important, I think there are certain, there's a big push, for example, because of the research in Carol Dweck's research in mindset about effort. Totally valid research, and that's an important part of teaching children to be successful, is to focus on effort over outcome, really teach them that hard work matters. And yet life is more complicated than this. And even today's talk on executive function only is really about one aspect of resilience because nothing is that black and white. And really what it's important to look at with children is that persistence only goes so far. So the drawing at the bottom represents the ant pushing the rubber tree plant. You know, you can have high hopes and work really, really hard, and yet if you don't have the actual skills to accomplish what you need to accomplish, you're still going to struggle. And when you look at somebody even like Albert Einstein, for all the rumors that he had attention and learning difficulties, on the other hand, you can say very concretely that he was both brilliant and had the ability to persist and problem solve and overcome adversity. Because what you find with poor executive function is you can be quite gifted in life, you can actually be quite, like the ant, quite motivated in life, and if you're struggling with managing and coordinating everything, you still might not get where you need to go. So when you look at what builds motivation and resilience in kids, I think it's important to put it in the context of there are many things that go into this. And today's talk is on this top skill set. Executive function has a lot to do with the skills we use to learn and the skills we use to manage our emotions and the skills we use to problem solve and persist. But before we think that's all that children need, we need to put it in the bigger context. And that's not all of what today's talk's about, and this relates a lot. I know Robert Brooks has been here before to a lot of what Robert Brooks talks about, that we need to not focus on any one aspect of these skills, but focus on the whole. And look at the fact that certainly mindset and grit matter, but even Carol Dweck has talked about how children still need to be corrected and they still need to be given skills in order to thrive. It's not only about the effort. And relationships, of course, are foundational. What Dr. Brooks calls one charismatic adult goes a long way for any child in his research. And then that overall focus on strengths and successes, the sense that I am capable of doing things, matters a lot for resilience as well. So in talking about executive function, I just want to make it clear that we're talking about just one piece of the puzzle that helps children thrive. But before I talk about how we can build executive function in childhood, I think it's important to look at things developmentally, and that's obviously my field. But I think this is actually where I hope for all of you can learn something very practical. Because if you can understand executive function developmentally, and if that slide is hard to read from anybody in the back, it says, and that's how you make a peanut butter sandwich. When we begin to look at executive function developmentally, we can really begin to see what it is that children need at different ages from us. So what this slide represents to me is the fact that certainly at preschool age, early elementary school age, children probably know how to make a sandwich, and yet if we set them loose in the kitchen, it may come out somewhat like this. But then if you think what happens like 10 years later, 10 years later, kids have the same factual information, but they're going to manage it differently. They're going to put it together differently. And in fact, some 14-year-olds can probably get a meal on the table. It's a bell curve, not everyone's the same, but you see a big change. But you wouldn't want the average 14-year-old to run a restaurant. So the average 14-year-old might be able to tell you everything that goes into running a restaurant, but there's no way they were going to actually coordinate and plan it all, because what happens with child development and executive function is executive function matures all the way into our mid to late 20s. So 10 years later, you have people who are now in their mid-20s, and clearly by that age, some people are running kitchens and having jobs like that. And even then, there's some more room for further growth. So when we look at executive function, what's very, very different than I was taught in medical school, it's very, very different and than many of us really see in child development, is just the recognition that executive function is its own developmental path. So when you look at my field as a whole, what does it mean to understand child development? Well, it turns out that there are typical paths of development that we all follow in life. And I'll just let this catch up while I'm talking for a moment. But really the premise of my field in many different ways is the recognition that there is typical development. And surprisingly, that wasn't even considered standard of care not that long ago. So that we can begin to look at child development through the ages, and we just want to recognize what's typical, not expect too much of kids before their time, and then catch the kids who fall behind and try to catch them up. So, for example, most of you who are in the field or are parents probably have a relatively intuitive sense of language milestones. Right? So we all know, roughly speaking, kids speak by 1, and then anyone who spends a lot of time around kids is familiar with the language burst that happens for most kids near 2, and then by preschool they're conversational. And that's just kind of considered routine. And the important thing to consider is that we know that we need to promote language development for kids to be successful at school. And if kids fall behind, we need to catch them up and sort of identify why they're behind. And then there's social milestones, which just a few years ago I think most people weren't familiar with, but people are becoming increasingly familiar with. So what does it mean to fall behind in social milestones? Well, we know that typical markers of social development are things like responding to your name by your first birthday, pointing and gesturing is an instinctual skill for most kids. Turn-taking begins at a fascinatingly early age. They've shown turn-taking interactions in babies as young as around 6 weeks, imitating their parents. By 2 years, play becomes very much part of social development. So we can see social and play development, developing in this natural path. And of course, if someone falls behind in social development, we all know that puts them at risk. What does it mean to be behind in social development? I'm sure so practically speaking, it's a little more complicated than that, but if social development isn't happening intuitively, that puts you at risk for autism. Autism is what happens when social development doesn't happen naturally. So what does that look like then when it comes to executive function? So executive function, it turns out, follows exactly the same type of path. And that's what I want to focus on today. And this is where, hopefully, like I said, I want you to come out of this with some sense of why this matters to the average parent. What this is, why seeing this differently can really affect how we live day to day and hopefully make it easier. So on an academic level, this is the last sort of not so practical things, but this is not going to change how we live so much. It's interesting just that there is now research going on tracking executive function all the way back to early childhood, early back to infancy even. So since executive function is the part of the brain we use to hold on to information and manipulate information in life, even in babies we can begin to see how it changes. So for example, if I was to drop something below a tabletop, the first half of the first year, kids just think it's gone. They don't even look for it. And then second half of the year, they begin to notice it. They remember that it's there, which is executive function. And then in toddlers, we start to see the behavioral part of executive function. Somewhere through toddlerhood, you have to learn not to hit everybody who frustrates you. Although it's normal going into toddlerhood to hit a lot of people who frustrate you. It's part of developing self-management skills. And then those age groups, I don't know that executive function really matters that much to the average parent, but then by the time we get to preschool, it actually becomes very important to understand what executive function looks like. And this is where sometimes we can catch ourselves, and if we're aware of what to expect, start managing things somewhat differently. So this slide says, I've got this center of the universe gig because really the developmental role of executive function in this age group for kids is to expand out, is to start seeing things like time and the perspective of others, and to not be totally self-driven in different ways. One way I think that's practical to think of executive function is to just sort of look at it as bridging different gaps of time. They go into the preschool years as toddlers, they come out and have to manage a classroom. And there's lots of facts they need to learn and lots of other things they need to learn, but a lot of it relates directly to skills like sitting still and focused attention that are executive function based. So what we see in the preschool years is this gradual decrease in motor activity impulsiveness, and then an increasing ability to work through problems in your head. It's often called self-speech. So I was to say, like, in 10 minutes, we're going to go outside and finish this lecture outside. There needs to be a little bit of pre-planning that goes on. You need to say, like, okay, my jacket's over there, and I got to do this or that to get out the door on time. And if you don't have that pre-planning going on, you can think about the impact that would have of a child in a classroom. If you have poor executive function and you're not doing the pre-planning, suddenly we're going outside, and you don't know where your coat is, and you don't know having put your books in the locker, and so self-speech is part of it. But on a very practical level, a lot of what you need to understand about preschool executive function relates directly to behavioral management in this age group. So one of the things preschoolers lack is something called the time horizon, which is the ability to connect anything now to before or later. And when you start to think of the implications of that in terms of problems of behavioral management, it means that kids with preschool level executive function aren't tying anything that happens now to what could happen later. And they also have a very hard time with perspective taking, because another thing that's developing during this age group is something called theory of mind. So there's another study of preschool kids. Preschool kids get a lot of these little candy-based interventions. So there's a study of executive function in preschool kids where they give somebody at a table, there's, again, with the researcher, a candy box full of crayons. And they say to the child, okay, tell you what, we're going to call your friend over now. What's she going to think is in the box? And it turns out that going into your preschool years, what's the answer going to be? The answer is going to be, well, she's going to think there's crayons in the box. I can see there are crayons in the box. Why can't she see there's crayons in the box? And it's only as you develop executive function and theory of mind that towards the end of preschool, somewhere in that shift happens where a child's able to say, oh wait, she is going to think there's candy in the box, but she couldn't see what I could see. Now, all of that may sound kind of sort of dry and not so interesting, except when you tie it all together, what do you find? What you find is that in preschool, if you ask the average child when they knock someone over on the playground, can't you see you hurt her feelings? The developmentally appropriate answer is no. How could I possibly? And if you try to talk a preschool child into behaving differently, like, wouldn't it be better if we just did this? The answer is, I haven't any idea. Because in the end, they don't have any sense of past, future, and a time horizon. And when you tie all that together, it means that even the most brilliant, well-meaning preschooler is learning almost entirely behaviorally from immediate feedback. So in a up to 5-year-old range, and sometimes even a little longer in kids, you can talk all you want and it has different value. Discussion is about relationship formation and respect and all these really important things too. And yet, behavioral learning is just purely about immediate feedback. It's rewarding what we like, praising what we like, and very clear consequences for behaviors we don't like, because that's how the brain is wired at that age. And when we get caught up in talking to our preschooler and trying to convince them that they want to get out the door on time, even though they really don't care one way or the other if they get out the door on time, we find we're not going to get very far very fast. In school, though, is where the heart of executive function, it's where the rubber hits the road, because what happens in school is that everything in school requires management. So another way of thinking of executive function is almost anything you can put the word management to relates to executive function. We have to manage our attention, we have to manage projects, we have to manage tasks, we have to manage our emotions, we have to manage our impulses, we have to manage situations. All of that is executive function based. So pretty much everything we need to do to learn requires executive function. But when you look at, for example, the way the schools are teaching today, one of the things they've shown is that when we put excess demands on children in early childhood, what happens? Well, an overly academic kindergarten, for example, puts kids at risk for a misdiagnosis of ADHD, because there's a mismatch of what they're developmentally really should be expected to be doing, which is that entering school age, you're still barely out of preschool. You're not supposed to attend for that long. You're not supposed to sit still for that long. You're not supposed to manage your thoughts for writing. So writing, it turns out, if you go down this list of executive function-based skills, information management is the part of your brain that allows you kind of to coordinate ideas and in a rational way get them on paper. And those skills are just maturing. And when you think about this same concept of bridging development, school-age executive function has to bridge an awful lot of stuff. It bridges going into school as a kindergartner and coming out of that same stretch as a high school student. And for all the concrete information you're learning, one of the main things you're picking up too is how do you manage a project? When should you be expected to manage a project? And it turns out that many kids are just starting that skill set in middle school. Like it's typical development and really not have much idea how to do that. You know, when should you be able to manage time? Well, if you go back a couple of slides ago and look at that time window concept, it's really still only about 2 or 3 weeks out as kids become teenagers. When you look at what you need to be doing in the classroom to learn, it includes everything from organizing and managing your time, to organizing and managing information for notes and conversation and writing. Executive function is also where we problem solve. It's cognitive flexibility. It's being able to see things in different ways. It's about efficiency and speed. It's about attention span, very much so. And it's really the underpinning for almost all of academics. So there's lots of great research going on, for example, around executive function and reading. It turns out to read, you both need decoding skills, and you need to be able to process the information at a reasonable rate and hold on to the information long enough to tie together the beginning of the page to the end of the page. And executive function in and of itself is actually somewhat protective in kids who have learning disabilities, for example, because there's a Stanford group that's done research showing that if you have reading disabilities with poor executive function, you're far less likely to overcome that on your own or quickly than if you have strong executive function, because executive function is the problem-solving base of our brain. So that these managerial skills are what carries us all through kindergarten through high school. And I'm going to tie all this together into some of the more practicalities of what that actually means in education. But another really vital aspect to understand about this developmental path is the recognition that very, very differently than most of us were taught in medical school, at least a generation ago, it turns out that typical child development continues into your mid to late 20s. So this slide, for anyone who can't read it, just says adolescence is coming. You know, we can't treat the fact that kids become teens. They do become teens. It's a wonderful stage, but it's also a little bit of upheaval at the same time for many different reasons. One of which is that if you look at this slide, darker color shows increasing maturation of the outer parts of the brain. It turns out executive function is very much related to the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. For those of you who are fans, I'm sure you've heard that term more than once. There's been several speakers I saw on the list who talk about executive function. But the problem is that when it comes to parenting teens, you have to recognize that all the way here through age 20, it's still not fully mature, and that full maturation of planning and judgment and everything else that involves being a mature adult doesn't happen until your mid-20s for most kids. So what you have when you're dealing with a teenager is someone who's going through an area of rapid growth in executive function, and probably someone who developmentally wants to be far apart from their parents in many ways. They're not far apart as much as separating from their parents. It's normal development to try to individuate during these years. They may be very emotional for different reasons. There's all this other stuff going on. And yet, as a bottom line, the part of their brain responsible for planning, judgment, impulse control is 10 years away from being fully mature. And as I said this morning, if you look at teen development through that lens, you realize they still need our collaboration and involvement in a major way quite often. And when you start to look at how we treat teens in this country, you begin to realize that there's somewhat of a disconnect at times. The example I used this morning is you look at a problem like sexting, and you realize, like, well, if you hand the average teenager a device that allows them to impulsively make a mess of things like that all at once, while they're being teenagers who have their first crush and they're emotional and all these other things are going on, But this supervisory managerial part of their brain is a long way from being mature. To some degree, that problem's kind of, and I don't mean this trivially, people make a mess of it, but from a developmental point of view, it's kind of like, well, of course a lot of them are going to have problems with stuff like that. Because developmentally, they're not mature yet. And a lot of the problem with this internet-driven culture that I think we need to try to rein in some is that we can't just expose kids to everything that adults can handle. And teens are teens. And I always look at, just because I mentioned technology, I'll just touch on it for a moment. I always look at technology as kind of like offering kids the car keys. It's like, it's just a tool, it's neither good nor bad, but you gotta show us you're using it well, or we're not gonna, we're gonna do some more education and make sure, we set some limits right up until you do. So really understanding teen development means recognizing they need to be allowed to become individuals, and they need to be, given more freedom, and maybe we need to collaborate more, all while also realizing that for many or most teens, they are a long way from mature executive function. But what does that all mean in day-to-day life? Because really, while all of that I hope is practical for people, really what it comes down to, I think, is understanding is that if these studies of executive function show that it so directly correlates with lifelong success, whatever can we do about that? And one of the things I find most reassuring about this concept is, for the most part, it cuts through a lot of the stuff that confuses us nowadays. It actually makes things a lot simpler when we can look at life through this lens of executive function. So I call this the AEIOUs of well-being, just as a way of organizing our thoughts around it. And I just want to touch on each of these 5 aspects of how we can look at executive function at a day-to-day level to try to simplify our decision making. So the first area of life to reflect on is just the activities we're prioritizing in life. And this is one of those things where it looks like, well, that's pretty common sense. Like, why do we even need to discuss that? Well, the answer is because life gets really busy anyway, and we prioritize all these other things, and we have all these things encroaching on our scheduling, and pressures to do one more class, and homework is crazy nowadays, and all these other things are going on. And yet on a very simple level, many of the basics have been shown to support both resilience and executive function. And there's an exercise I sometimes encourage families to do, or kids to do as they get older. We call it a mindful calendar exercise, where you just start from a blank calendar and fill it in backwards. So you just fill in, first you fill in the stuff that's totally fixed and unchangeable. You can't change school hours. But then fill in what you want to prioritize for your family. By the way, this is another trick question. It's a way of answering how much screen time is okay, especially during the school week. Because there is no black and white answer. But what you can do as a family is recognize that family meals have been correlated with tons of benefits in childhood, especially in teens. And play is important for kids, and downtime is important for kids, and sleep is important for kids. And the first thing you can do in sort of laying out this simpler lifestyle that takes care of our children is that calendar exercise. Is just fill in all the stuff you want to prioritize first, and that will tell you how much is left over for another class, or how much is left over for another video game. Far more directly, though, when we do that same exercise, it's important to reflect on the fact that there is a reason free play developed. And especially in early childhood, research suggests that in addition to social skills and things like cooperation, the reason play developed is it develops executive function specifically. So for example, there's a play-based program called Tools of the Mind, which has been studied primarily by a researcher named Adele Diamond, who's a brilliant researcher out of Vancouver. And she's shown very directly one thing and is hoping to show a second from the last I spoke with her, which is on the one hand, she's shown that Tools of the Mind, which is a play-based preschool program, it's all stuff you'd be familiar with. It's just imaginative play and manipulating games like red light, green light, and doing all these practical things day to day that are just old school play. Those children come out of the program with better executive function. She thinks that if she studies those kids into school age, they're going to have lower rates of ADHD as well, which we're going to come back to in a minute. And in general, what we find is that programs in preschool that build executive function actually set kids up for academic success, so that children who do early childhood play-based programs outperform kids who go through intensive academic preschools by early elementary school. There's a researcher named Marcia Denkla out of Johns Hopkins who calls the entire concept of pushing education on preschoolers premature education. She's shown in her research, for example, that the neurology that goes into fine motor skills for writing doesn't even mature till 6 or 7 for many boys. So that when you look at what's most going to set early childhood, children up for success in early childhood, in many ways it's just a lot of play. Now mind you, that's a simplification. They need language and they need relationships, but when it comes to executive function, it's play that does it. And when you set up the family schedule, a lot of time just downtime for play is actually most useful in preschool. It also turns out that unplugged play often builds executive function. And one of the things that's been shown that screen time encroaches on directly are things like reading and unstructured play. But reading probably links to executive function. There's even one group in England I know studying, and I'm not advocating for this, I don't play myself, but they're studying chess and showing success in building attention and executive function. Really anything that requires attention and executive function to do it probably builds executive function itself. And yet, if we're going to prioritize executive function in early childhood, we also have to recognize what disrupts executive function. So, I'm going to ask this question again, having never had it answered any other way. So how many of you in this room know kids who, after watching 9 minutes of cartoons, shut off the cartoon? So I'm still O for everybody. It never happens. So there was an early study, there was a study a few years ago done of executive function in which they compared 9 minutes of this character to 9 minutes of PBS to 9 minutes of a crafts activity, and showed that after just 9 minutes of watching SpongeBob, which I probably shouldn't say in a talk that's being recorded, but that was the study, but after 9 minutes of SpongeBob, they were able to show deficits of executive function, acute changes in executive function. And it turns out that screen time itself, more screen time correlates with worsening attention spans, even when you control for who had a short attention span to begin with. So as we're talking about all these things that support early childhood success, one of the most important things to recognize is the overlap of setting limits around screen time to childhood success. And in fact, one of my favorite sort of concise summaries of the entire concept is that strong parental involvement in moderating screen time all on its own correlates with social, academic, and physical outcomes, better in all 3 cases. Because when you look at technology, it's just a tool. It can be used well, it can be used poorly, but it requires a lot of self-management. It requires a lot of time management skills, it requires a lot of impulse control, it requires a lot of planning that all of us as adults struggle with at different times. And one of the single most important things we can do to protect our children in early childhood, specifically because of this path of executive function, is when we're balancing all these activities. The way I describe it to children also, as we look at these few slides and activities, the way I think of them is it's kind of like brain nutrition. Most kids, most parents are familiar with the nutrition plate. Maybe some of you, I guess they got rid of the pyramid. We now have this nutrition plate. Looks kind of like a pie chart. You can think of brain nutrition the same way. For every child, they need a balanced approach to activities that covers many different things. And screen time can just be a sliver of it for healthy development. What does the E stand for? The E stands for the environment we're raising kids in, and even that can get muddled at times. So what sort of environment sets kids up for resilience and success? Well, there's really 2 parts to it. One has to do with the ability to focus on effort. This is where executive function links together with mindset and grit. I don't know if Carol Dweck has been here before, but I think Angela Duckworth has. All that research and effort, it's really important. Although I would say, like I said before, that effort alone isn't always enough, and we're going to come to why that is in just a moment. The important thing to recognize about executive function, though, is that a warm, stable environment isn't enough either. Because children, by definition, have immature brain managers. They can't manage their own behavior well all the time. They can't make good choices all the time. And part of how children learn is through banging up against limits. It's through getting frustrated in a warm home environment. And there was a trend that sort of swept through the world of child development about 10, 15 years ago, which really heavily suggested that kids should never get upset, that we should always anticipate their needs ahead of time, that if they were, that a crying child, we'd sort of missed our cue. When in reality, if we understand executive function, we realize that, of course, kids are going to get upset. And part of, even if you want to tie this back together to managing screen limits, for example, is the recognition that we just got to understand at any given age, our children don't always have the maturity to make the right decision. So that at home, it's all about this balanced environment of both warmth and positive feedback with strict limit setting. And we want to explore always like finding that middle ground and making sure we're being consistent on both ends of the spectrum. When it comes to teens, I've already alluded to the fact that we have to give them more and more freedom while recognizing their own self-management skills. They think they're young adults and they want to be out on their own, and yet they may not quite be there yet. It has a lot to do with collaboration and boundaries. Like Wendy Mogul says, I don't know if she said it when she was here a couple of weeks ago, the concept often that she uses is it's like putting money in the bank constantly, so fostering all the positive parts of your relationship, but they're going to have to bang up against something at some point or another, which is the same concept, just a maturing one in teens. And then one of the most important things to recognize, I think, sort of societally about the environment we're raising children in is the concept of toxic stress, which is not, by the way, the routine stress that we're all living under day to day. So if you look at toxic stress, there's actually a concept that somebody actually asked me about before the talk called epigenetics, which is to say that someone brought up in a traumatic environment actually rewires how they are going to manage stress their whole lives on some level. So if we want to support resilience in children as a society, kind of as a public health issue, we have to work on environment on that level also. But hopefully what this this beginning take on executive function is meant to show is simply that the basics work. And in some ways you can look at executive function as like the modern science of back to the basics parenting. It's reassuring yourself that you don't need to be doing more all the time. You don't have to be pushing kids harder all the time, because actually what sets them up for success are these basics. Now when you want to move into something new when it comes to executive function, it has to do with the I, which is instruction. And this is really where we start tying together one of the concepts that I feel most strongly about, that I spend a lot of time in, which is the recognition that anything we do repetitively throughout our entire lives rewires the brain. Again, not what I was taught in medical school. It's why habits are hard to break. And it means that really when they've studied up until senior citizens, they can show that if you learn a new skill, there's physical growth in the brain. The brain develops to some degree like a muscle in essence. So executive function explains part of the research then around the practice of mindfulness. So another way we can look at how are we going to develop resilience in kids, how are we going to develop their own ability to manage problems in life, it's through direct instruction. And what mindfulness turns out to be is there's a great book on the science of mindfulness just out called Altered Traits, which really just explores the fact that this is where the science has gotten to. What we're trying to do is change traits in ourselves through repetition and practice. So for all of the kind of pop headlines on a day-to-day level, what mindfulness is doing is on a practical level building skills directly of attention, focused attention, and then staying settled. So life happens, things are stressful, we're never going to be perfect, but we can practice staying settled under stress, and it becomes easier over time. There's another aspect of it that's really important that has to do with awareness and habit and seeing things clearly and not getting caught up in just reactivity or assumptions, and changing how we believe about what we believe and how we live. And then there's a really broader part that we can use to instruct children in that has to do with compassion and how we're living. And it feels like as I'm going through this is actually all the speakers I often talk about, and many of them have been here. Certainly Richie Davidson's early childhood program has shown some really interesting benefits around simply teaching children to treat others differently. And it's amazing that it actually works. So there's something called the kindness curriculum. And in the kindness curriculum, they can show that children will share differently from beginning to end of this, roughly, I think it's about a 12-week mindfulness program. Attention and executive function improve also. When you look at research in mindfulness, the reason even I'm talking about mindfulness as a physician, I actually found it very useful for myself when I was introduced to it many, many years ago and kept it to myself for a long time. But research is really showing that really all the way down to early childhood, it's been shown to improve well-being, anxiety, depression, attention and executive function, even for kids who have ADHD, and really a whole slew of mental and physical benefits. And this isn't a mindfulness talk specifically, since it's an overview of executive function. I'm not going to go down this path of mindfulness too long today. except to recognize that unlike we used to think about child development, in many, many ways, we can instruct kids directly. We can try to teach them through our actions, teach them through mindfulness practice, these skills that are going to set them up for resilience. Although I always want to end this little section on mindfulness practice, which touching on something I think is important to recognize too, which another aspect of mindfulness practice is it's like the opposite of perfectionism. And the reason I always bring that up, even though I'm not talking too much about mindfulness today, is that I always feel like when you give a talk on parenting, it's really hard, I never want people to feel like they're being put on the spot. Like it doesn't matter what decisions you made before, everyone's inherently doing what they can and doing their best. I just think people should have the information that helps them make easier decisions. So when it comes to self-compassion, there's just a recognition that we all have this inner critic that's alive and well most of the time. This voice of parenting that says, I should have done that differently, I should be better, if only I had, and this, that, and the other thing. And one of the things we can practice with mindfulness, one of the things we can practice when we do it, even listening to a talk like this, is the recognition that we're always doing our best as parents, because what else would we do? And then we can pause and sort of recognize those critical voices and just try to catch ourselves and recognize them as those are also just mental habit. They're not really so valuable all on their own. And we can try to practice through mindfulness or just in day-to-day life, if you don't want to practice mindfulness, trying to treat ourselves like we would our best friend and just sort of say well, that's different than I hoped it was going to turn out, and then try to give ourselves the same advice we would a friend. And it's an important thing to come back to, I think, whenever we reflect on our own parenting, because otherwise we can easily just consume ourselves with self-judgment. So the O of AEIOU has to do with old-fashioned education. It says, here we go again, did anyone here not eat his or her homework on the way to school? Because it turns out one of the most profound places to explore what executive function means is recognizing typical executive function in the school setting, and then trying to make decisions around education that reflect on executive function appropriately too. So, for example, as I alluded to before, Stephen Hinshaw has done research showing that if you have an overly academic kindergarten program, kids are falsely diagnosed with ADHD. Because for many kids, kindergarten is still a play-based year in developmentally. They're not ready to be doing reading and writing. And in fact, over this generation, there's been an assumption in certainly this demographic, in the schools, that children should be almost going into kindergarten reading and writing. Except that developmentally, we know that that doesn't really make sense for a lot of kids. Even some very brilliant boys in particular are just not ready for that quite yet. As long as they're progressing well in terms of language and what we call pre-academic skills, they're going to do fine in school, but they're not supposed to be able to manage things at that level yet. And then when you come out of it to the other end, you can look at high schoolers and realize we're often treating high schoolers like college kids in terms of the workloads they're supposed to be managing. But they don't have a college student's level of executive function either. Actually, I think that's a double problem. There's also there's a math problem that's being failed there too, which is college students tend to have way more free time. Their class schedules are lighter in general. So if you give a college student a lot of homework every night, that's just kind of what college is expected to be. But if you give a really busy high school student a college level workload, it doesn't set them up for success most of the time. It just exhausts them. There's another aspect of executive function that's important to look at in schools, because a lot of what we're doing in schools nowadays is something called problem-based learning. Problem-based learning, a lot of just figuring out your own, learning through thinking and planning, which is awesome. It's a great way to learn, except that there's also research suggesting that for any new skill in life, we all benefit a lot if we get a lot of emphasis on fluency and a solid foundation first. So executive function is the part of the brain that we use to plan and problem solve. So if you're someone who has a normal early elementary school level of executive function, often a vital part of education is a more traditional curriculum for many kids. And when you look at what evidence-based curriculum instruction, for example, in reading looks like, it's very direct instruction until you are totally fluent in the basics before you go off and do something else. And you can think an easy analogy when it comes to almost any academic skill in early childhood is the recognition that it's not that different from a sport or an instrument. How many of you who have never played piano before could just go pick up piano without somebody teaching you the notes, chords, and scales first? You know, how many of you could just go start playing lacrosse without some basic instruction first about how to play the sport? And when you look at executive function in academics, for example, you know, everything, for example, nowadays is so word problem based. Well, what goes into solving a word problem? Well, if you're not fluent in reading and you're not fluent in math, since executive function is the part of the brain you use to problem solve, then you're using executive function an awful lot to figure out the reading part of it, and then you're using executive function an awful lot to do the math part of it, and then you also have to use executive function to sort of navigate the language, the word problem itself, to figure out what you're supposed to be doing. But for any student who has been taught to the point that they're fluent, they're not putting demands on executive function anymore. So for your fluent reading skills, that's a whole other part of the brain. And for math skills that are fluent, that's a whole other part of the brain. So by teaching to fluency in early childhood, you are freeing up executive function for the cool problem-based learning that has to happen later. And then when it comes to executive function itself, it's like, how does the average high school student learn to manage their workload? Well, they're the ones with immature executive function to begin with. And like anything else in life, if we understand typical executive function, one of the things our children are going to benefit most from is simply a lot of instruction in how to manage stuff until they've got it. So if your child happens to know how to manage time really well, let them run. But if you start to see them struggle, you have to recognize it's a skill, and it's a skill that may be behind, and they probably need more instruction in it. They need help. Because actually, as it turns out, executive function is the planning and problem solving part of the brain. So planning and problem solving your way out of your own executive function problems can be pretty challenging. And I alluded to the fact that really one of the areas we have this mismatch between actual child development and what's going on in the world is, did you guys show this documentary here? It sort of went around, a lot of you probably saw this. Like the pressures, this is a documentary about the pressures we're putting on high school students, and one of the things that's being missed here is that the average high school student is a long way, not just from being skilled in managing time and planning, but it has to do with judgment. It even has to do with self-advocacy. That's such a buzzword in high school nowadays. You know, it's the part of the brain that lets you figure out exactly what sort of help you might need. And all of this means that our high schoolers often just need us in this sort of more collaborative kind of, they're becoming adults kind of way, to sort of reach out and help support them through what is a really kind of pressured, overscheduled point of time from a developmental point of view. And then the last part of executive function that it's important to understand is that executive function is a developmental path just like any other. So when children fall behind in language skills, you know, we talk to them a little differently, and then we try to get them speech-language therapy. And if children fall behind in motor skills, you know, no one's happy about it, but we try to get them physical therapy so they can start walking sooner. But one of the most important things we need to recognize in the modern world, in spite of all the confusing headlines, in spite of everything else going on, is that ADHD, practically speaking, is what it means to have an executive function delay. And separate from whatever you might think about treatment, separate from the fact that it's overdiagnosed in parts of the world, it also happens to be underdiagnosed in parts of the world, separate from everything you might have heard about executive function, on a very basic level, research in ADHD is the flip side of the coin to research in executive function and mindfulness. So on the one hand, we have all this research showing what happens if you have strong executive function skills. You know, you tend to do better in school, you tend to do better socially, you tend to do better behaviorally. And the flip side of that is if you have undertreated ADHD or untreated ADHD, you tend to struggle in school, and you tend to struggle socially, and you tend to struggle in all these other parts of life, not because you don't care. There's a famous book about ADHD from years ago called Late, Lazy, and Unprepared. And it's totally unfair. I mean, that was the point of the book. You know, kids get labeled late, lazy, and unprepared because ADHD impacts time management and forgetfulness, and all these executive function-based skills are behind your peers. And in spite of all the misunderstandings, I guess the one way I would summarize, I think the one-liner I think that most summarizes the reality of ADHD is that the generic heritance of ADHD is similar to the generic heritance of height. It is not something our society creates. It's not something that has to do with environment. If kids are put up for adoption, you know, it is their biological parents that most influence whether or not they're going to have ADHD. So if we're really to understand executive function and support kids who need help, we need to look at it as a developmental condition like any other. and really try to see it from the perspective of the of an individual, adult or child who has it. It doesn't mean they're off the hook. It doesn't mean they're not responsible for their own behavior. It just means that while they're doing different things, we have to recognize that they are delayed in self-management skills. They need help in catching up in attention management and task management. And when it comes to educational settings, for example, I often summarize it as forgetfulness is an ADHD symptom. If you're punishing a student with ADHD over and over again for being forgetful by marking their grades down without offering them a solution, you are just punishing them for having a medical condition. You know, they can't help but be forgetful because they're the ones with ADHD. We have to reach out, assume everything is executive function initially, is the way I typically phrase it. Like, we can't know that for sure, but it's a valuable way of helping catch kids up, is you just sort of say, like, okay, what if this is all executive function? He looks unmotivated, you know, but motivation involves planning and persistence and foresight and priority setting and all these skills that are directly impacted by having poor executive function. And you can do that across anything ADHD potentially affects, and then try to come up with a plan to catch someone up. So when it comes to understanding executive function fully, honestly, one of the things that interested me in even trying to tie things all together to this is that all of these different things come together around this path of development called executive function. ADHD relates to it, and mindfulness relates to it. Resilience relates to it, and in its own way, mindset and grit relate to it too, because we have to look at building both effort and skills. And all of these things come together around this one path of development where hopefully, through understanding how it unfolds over time, we can begin to make very practical decisions and let go of all the extra stuff in life. You know, because what really builds resilience in children is just a common sense approach to activities, a balanced approach to how we're living at home, you know, maybe teaching mindfulness if that interests us, really looking at how our children are being educated, intervening for the kids who are behind, and really hopefully being able to reassure ourselves that if we address resilience in kids, if we focus on the things that help set our kids up for long-term success, we can reassure ourselves that we're doing everything we need to be doing as a parent. Because there is no perfect. It's all about that concept of just giving them the boots that they're going to use to navigate their own road ahead one day. So to just kind of briefly summarize then, you know, really executive function is this managerial level skill set that represents all of our self-regulatory capacities day to day. And it really is something that we can fundamentally understand from early childhood all the way through adulthood. I didn't even say this in passing yet, but even as adults, the decisions we make often affect our executive function in different ways. And executive function on a day-to-day level is what we're all using to manage whatever's difficult in life. So I hope that's a practical approach to executive function you all can take home. I'm happy to stick around for questions as long as anyone would like, but thank you all for your attention today.